Hi there, guys. I'm not sure if people keep up with what's going on in American politics, or whether people try and block it out now because of how mad it is. But there was an absolutely remarkable story this week in which Trump claimed that paracetamol causes autism. So let's have a quick look at what he was talking about, and then I'll explore it and try and work out what he's actually up to here.
So since 2000, autism rates have surged by much more than 400%. Instead of attacking those who ask questions, everyone should be grateful for those who are trying to get the answers to this complex situation. And the first day all of these great doctors behind me were there, I told them, this is what we have to find out. Because when you go from 20,000 to 10,000, and then you go to 12, there's something artificial. They're taking something. And by the way, I think I can say that there are certain groups of people that don't take vaccines and don't take any pills that have no autism. That have no autism. Does that tell you something? That's currently, is that a correct statement, by the way?
There are some studies that suggest that, yeah, with the Amish, for example.
The Amish, yeah, virtually. I heard none. See, Bobby wants to be very careful with what he says, and he should, but I'm not so careful with what I say. But you have certain groups. The Amish, as an example, they have essentially no autism. First, effective immediately, the FDA will be notifying physicians that the use of let's see how we say that. Acetaminophen. Acetaminophen. Is that okay? Which is basically commonly known as Tylenol, during pregnancy can be associated with a very increased risk of autism.
So I'm not going to bother trying to analyse what he said or push back against it, because I think everybody knows that what he's saying is total bollocks. And for me at least, there's no point trying to argue against his points with facts, because it's 2025, isn't it? Facts don't matter to his supporters, and they're the only people who listen to him or take him seriously. In terms of what he's talking about here, Trump's a bad faith actor who just makes stuff up all the time. So what's the point in trying to rebut his points or deal with them in good faith? But as I said at the start, what I want to try and think about here is what he's actually doing here by making these crazy claims, and what his broader goal is. As I said, I'm not here today to explain in detail what autism is or isn't. I'm just going to note that it's best understood as a form of neurological diversity. And that is, someone with autism, they might have a unique way of understanding the world around them, or they might have specific needs around social communication, sensory stimuli, or daily routines, for example. And as it's a spectrum disorder, people might have greater or lesser need in any of those areas. But having said that, I think it's well established now that people with autism can lead, full, meaningful lives. And if there are specific support needs for any individual, it's easy enough for us as a society to come together to meet those needs. And it's also important to note that we're much better as a society now at recognising when someone is on the autism spectrum. So the diagnostic tools that we've got are better, and we're also able to identify support needs at an earlier stage, based on a person's presentation or their personality. So just in terms of numbers, in a UK context, there's been a significant increase in autism diagnoses over recent history. There was a near 800% increase in autism diagnoses from 1998 to 2018. And as of March 2024, there were approximately 700,000 people with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And there were nearly 200,000 people in England who had an open referral for suspected autism, or who were awaiting assessment or diagnosis. Now, the reason I mention all that is just because it's important context in understanding why Trump is claiming that paracetamol causes autism. So those are all numbers, but I want to move away here from the medical model language of diagnosis and treatment for a moment. Because as I mentioned earlier, people with autism, they can easily be supported within society, and in most instances, they can lead full and meaningful lives. However, the key to that happening is that us as a society, we have to have a shared view of what autism is, and we then have to have a shared responsibility to ensure that people with autism can lead those meaningful and full lives. So what I'm talking about here is us moving from a medical model to a social model. When we make that shift, we start to ask different questions. And the questions then become, how do we construct our society to meet every person's needs? How do we provide services to people with diverse needs? How does housing, healthcare, education and social care, for example, respond to a diverse community and to people with differing needs? And how does the jobs market respond to a population with people with diverse needs in it? And ultimately, when we're asking those questions, we're talking about us, as in a we. They're not questions about I. When we ask these questions, they're questions about the nature of society and how we support each other within that society. And that's important because, in my opinion, that is what Trump is arguing against here with these crazy claims about paracetamol and autism. When you think about who Trump is, he is someone who doesn't want any shared understanding between us as citizens, does he? In the Trump worldview, he sees people as individual economic units who exist in an aggressive and hostile form of libertarian capitalism. In his worldview, our job is to compete with one another for scarce resources in a sort of dog-eat-dog world where the strongest survive and the weak die off. And in his worldview, if we accept that people have differing needs, then of course that means that we need to provide support for people as a society. And that is exactly what he doesn't want, because, as I said, he totally rejects the idea of society or any shared understanding and responsibility between us. It goes against his sort of fundamental outlook, which is that we're all atomized individuals fighting for resources. So to bring this back to his specific claims on autism, if he can link autism to personal failure, so in this instance, a woman's use of paracetamol during pregnancy, then he's halfway towards not having to provide support to that person or family. So if enough people buy into this nonsense, he can create a system in which our shared bonds are frayed and destroyed to such an extent that if public money is then needed to perhaps assess someone or perhaps to support someone in the community, he and his mates can say, well, why should we pay for your failures as a parent? So to boil this down to a single sentence, what Trump's mad claims about paracetamol and autism are actually about is the individualisation of a societal issue so that he can advance his worldview and further erode our shared bonds and understanding. Yeah, and we have to fight back against this stuff. And that means standing in solidarity with, families and individuals with diverse needs and working to ensure that our public services and our society meet everyone's needs. But yeah, thank you for watching, guys. Please let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on Trump's ludicrous comments? Yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.